Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of a 3-part episode on Dubai. In the first episode, we get to learn a little bit more about the people of this region, the Bedouin, the Hadar, the Trucial states, the role of the British. We get to see a little bit more about the sleepy village that Dubai was as it started to become a port, really more in the scale of the famous entreports of the past, the Venice, the Amsterdams, and of course, how everything came to a screeching halt as external conditions challenged Dubai and its efforts. In the second episode, we are picking up our story a little bit farther ahead, now in the 40s and into the early 50s, because a new character, a new member of the Al Maktoum family, Rashid, is going to become a sheik. And he, perhaps more than anyone else in the ruling family, is going to single-handedly mold Dubai into what it is today. So let's jump into part 4 and learn a little bit more about Rashid. Part 4. The Quest. Dubai went from a sleepy village to a village that was starting to wake up with its entrepreneur business back into sleep. And now, as we pick up our story here in the late 1940s, early 1950s, it's starting to wake up again. Construction is starting to pick up in the city. This will be a constant theme now for Dubai going forward. Just a never-ending sound of construction. The buildings, the projects are going to just simply get more outrageous as time goes on. But we have to remember, oil has now arrived in Dubai yet. It has not arrived in Abu Dhabi. It has arrived in other areas in the Middle East, and we'll look at that in a second. The main character of our story is a new member of the Al Maktoum family, Rashid bin Saeed Al Maktoum. He's going to become the official sheik, the tribal ruler, in 1958, and it is on his vision that Dubai is going to start its amazing transformation. Of the 7 regions in the area on the Trucial Coast, Dubai was the first in the years following World War II to become conscious of its need to alter its social and economic structure. Long before oil money arrives, Dubai is going to be on the vanguard of a movement to modernize itself. Now we know, because of a story, that in a way Dubai was starting to do this in the early 1900s. Its efforts were stopped with the collapse of the pearl industry, the stock crash in 1929, and the Great Depression. But now that World War II is over, the British are back. Now, the British are back in a slightly different form, and we'll see this in a second. We have to understand the British Empire is not going to be the same after World War II. They are going to be in severe financial difficulties after a war that nearly destroyed the entire continent. But they are back nonetheless, and the entreport strategy is going to pick up speed in the years following World War II and into the 1950s. The population of Dubai is going to make up about half of the total population of the entire Trucial states, the entire 7 areas. And its government is going to be the most advanced by the time we get into the 1960s, which is when oil is going to become prevalent in the area. Now, Sheik Rashid had been running things, at least unofficially, for nearly 2 decades before he became the official ruler. So basically from, late 1930s until he becomes the ruler in 1958. But him becoming the ruler officially in 1958 means he gets absolute power, at least within the border towns of Dubai, right? Remember that once you're out in the desert, you're out in the empty quarter, the rule itself is a little bit different among the Bedouin. Now, within a year of him becoming the official ruler in 58, Dubai is going to have a modern port. Within 4 years, electricity, running water, and telephones. A bridge is going to span the Dubai Creek in 5 years, and streetlights is going to eliminate the town a year later. Queen Elizabeth II is going to pay Sheik Rashid not 1, but 2 visits. The first one to tour Dubai's new airport terminal, which is going to open in 1972, and the second to inaugurate the Middle East's tallest building in 1979. The airport terminal is going to be interesting to our story, since this will also be the precursor to Dubai launching one of the most successful airlines, Emiratis Airlines. Now, Sheik Rashid is really seen widely as the driving force behind the expansion of Dubai. He's coming into a Dubai that has been hobbled by poverty since those multiple factors took hold in the 1920s, 1930s, and he is obsessed with trying to modernize Dubai. He saw what happened in the 1930s, of course, as the merchant class tried to uprise and take power away from his family. And his way forward, his belief of how to move forward in the future to prevent a sliding back into poverty, is simply to modernize, to become not just perhaps the busiest entreport in the region, but to become that and much more, and to diversify the economy. So you may be a busy entreport, but you only have one export, you only have one good. What would it look like if you have multiple exports? So he's going to do whatever he can to build out Dubai into a modern city. This drive is really quite unique. Again, Abu Dhabi, it does not quite have the same drive. Its development will lag, as mentioned before. So Sheik Rashid is going to almost single-handedly drive the progress of Dubai from the 1950s onwards. Now, there's no really specific date for the beginning of the rise of modern Dubai, but a good place to look is actually the dredging of the Dubai Creek in 1960. If you recall, this inlet of water was typically not deep enough for large vessels to come through into it. So you were mostly seeing smaller boats. By 1960, Sheik Rashid is going to dredge it. It's simply going to make it deeper and allow larger vessels to sail into it. This is going to be helpful as you're then able to build ports closer to the cities and other transportation links. And this is kind of seen as this key moment that marks the rise of Dubai. Now, to do it, Sheik Rashid is going to have to borrow huge amounts of money to be able to pull off this project. It was a highly risky venture, as the money necessary to complete it was simply far higher than Dubai's annual income. Now, the dredging is going to be a success, and it will enable vessels of any size to dock at the port, and this is going to cause other markets to take off, in particularly the gold market, which we're going to see in a second. Now, Sheik Rashid had to get creative when it came to financing. He simply went to everyone and anyone who can help him do this, and he would end up with loans from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and gifts from his son-in-law, who at the time was the ruler of Qatar. Now, both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia already have oil by this point in our story, and they're already reaping the benefits of oil wealth, which we're going to see in the next section is just simply staggering. But Sheik Rashid doesn't have that wealth, at least not yet. So he has to go and get those loans, maybe gifts if possible, and then he's going to use that money to finance the development of his vision, starting with the dredging of the Dubai Creek. As his projects get developed, then of course there's more revenue coming in. The port starts to become busier. Other goods start to rise, like gold. And that revenue is then funneled to build even more projects. So this is what Sheik Rashid's life is looking like here in the 1950s into the 1960s. Just simply trying to make this vision work with what were, objectively speaking, limited resources. Now, I do want to underscore here just the level of vision that Sheik Rashid had for what Dubai could be. His son, Mohammed, which is the current ruler of Dubai, he once came to his dad when his dad was involved in all the projects, and some merchants had actually come up to Mohammed and asked him to talk to Sheik Rashid on their behalf to discuss a large port that he was trying to build. Now, this port is going to eventually be called Jebel Ali, and the merchants believed that this Jebel Ali port did not really make much sense. The economy was not doing that well, right? Again, we're still in the 1950s. And Dubai already had a port, which was called Port Rashid. So the merchants just simply couldn't understand why Sheik Rashid was trying to funnel so much of their limited resources into building a second port when it just didn't seem like there was enough need for it. So Mohammed decided to approach his father one time, and they were out looking at the construction area where Jebel Ali will eventually be finished. And he asked his father why they were building the second port, it just didn't seem to make much logical sense. His father looked at him, but did not respond. They eventually went back to the car, and as he relaxed and put his feet on the dash, Sheik Rashid then turns to his son, Mohammed, and says, quote, listen, my son, I never answered your question because I did not want the engineers to hear, but I can tell you that the reason I am building this port now is because there will come a time when you will not be able to afford to do so. And in that sense, Sheik Rashid was right. Now, Jebel Ali port is not going to open until 1979, but by the time it opens, it's going to be used at full capacity very quickly, and actually there'll be a need to expand it. And Mohammed, when he takes over the rule of Dubai in 1990, will be able to look back at the time and realize that the building of the Jebel Ali port was actually timed correctly by his father, and from the 1990s onwards, it would have been a significantly more expensive endeavor to try and build. And Mohammed says that, when you look at this project in hindsight, you can see that it would have been incredibly difficult to try to pitch it to anyone. He says, you go to this area, the Jebel Ali area, and it's completely remote of any kind of water, vegetation, or people. And in this remote area, we want to build the largest man-made port ever. Despite that the existing port, Port Rashid, is already the Middle East's largest port and has 35 berths. This kind of argument just would not have really sold anyone. But Sheik Rashid believed otherwise, and he saw a world where Port Rashid was simply not enough for Dubai, and they needed a completely second port and an ability to expand the second port. So this is the kind of projects and the kind of vision that Sheik Rashid is seeing for Dubai, and simply trying to make happen regardless of opposition or lack of resources. We also have to, of course, note here that the political nature of Dubai at the time, and even today, the opposition is limited in the sense that there's really no government that can oppose here. It's Sheik Rashid has the ultimate say in what will happen or not happen. But nonetheless, the merchant group is an influential group in the area, as we saw from that 1930s uprising. So despite their objections, Sheik Rashid continues to build out his vision of Dubai, whatever the cost may be. Now, the rate of growth from the 1950s onward is quite remarkable. Its import trade was worth around £3 million in 1958, 6.1 in 1960, and 8 million in 1963. By 1967, the figure is going to jump to 41.7 million, and in 1968 is going to be 70 million. There'll be new goods that are going to become essential to the Dubai economy, gold being one of those. And the Dubai government is going to get a source of revenue by having a customs duty levied by the ruler himself. And the greatest part of the Dubai imports were simply then re-exported back up. There were some intriguing rules that Dubai was able to take advantage based on what other countries were doing. Gold is one of those. Dubai positioned itself as an attractive place where gold could be imported and then re-exported to other countries like India or London. And this position as an entreport that welcomes all business is going to provide the drive that's going to build Dubai very rapidly. In 1966, more gold went from London to Dubai than to any other country in the world except France and Switzerland. Dubai also imported $150 million worth of watches and 5 million ounces of silver. And it's safe to assume that only a very small quantity was not re-exported soon after. Now, there were elements here that were perhaps of a somewhat illicit nature. There's a large portion of gold that is smuggled into India, and a good portion of that seemed to find its way through Dubai. This is another theme that we might see here as Dubai takes its entreport stance. Some of the rules around it are not always seen as positive by other countries. Dubai allows the flowing of certain goods in ways that other countries might not agree with. But again, nonetheless, the entreport business is growing quickly based on all the changes that Rashid is making. Now, new amenities are going to sweep Dubai one after another. An ice plant, radio, television broadcast, streetlights, a municipal government, a police force, and even the use of concrete. And even though Dubai is among the last places in the region to get these things, we have to remember that some of the other regions in the Emiratis, in the 7 regions that we've been looking at, are going to get them even after Dubai. And all of this is to confirm that if there's really any state in the Middle East that has lifted itself up into economic prosperity by its own bootstraps, it is Dubai. Dubai is doing all of this without oil money. And the city now has an air of prosperity. There's a bustle. There's a growing sense to the markets, to the ports. All of this is now going from the late 1950s into the early 1960s and beyond. And they're all being driven by one person, Sheik Rashid, who has seen the vision of what the city could be and doing his best to build that as rapidly as he can with limited resources. However, his vision is about to be supercharged because in 1966, Dubai is going to uncover oil. Part 5. The lottery ticket. There's a new sound in Dubai. We have heard the sounds of the pier, of the boats, of the children running around and swimming in the water. But now, the new sound is of machines pumping oil out of the ground in Dubai. This sound is quite common now in the region. Many countries in the Middle East have found oil. In fact, it's likely easier to list the countries that did not find oil than the ones that did. And the finding of oil is a big part of a story. Now, this is likely perhaps the part of the story you expected. Here's Dubai, a city that became wealthy on oil. And it's honestly the story I expected when I first started to research this episode. But as we have seen, that's not completely true. Dubai has been trying to modernize since the early 1900s. Its efforts have been limited by external forces. And Sheik Rashid has been doing superhuman efforts to build large projects with limited resources. You might argue that some of the money that came from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia is technically oil money, which would be true, but it's not Dubai's oil money, not until now. The first Arab country to find oil was Iraq in 1927. And the strikes seem to get close to Dubai ever since, but never quite at Dubai. Bahrain, which is a Gulf island just west of Dubai, struck oil in 1932. And then Kuwait and Saudi Arabia struck it in 1938, and Qatar in 1940. And we cannot forget Iran, which was the first country in the region to find oil in 1908. Iran is technically not an Arab country, so it wouldn't be the first Arab country. That goes to Iraq. But nonetheless, the region was first marked by Iran. And British interest in the form of Anglo-Persian were typically in Iran on the ground in the early 1900s. So from that point onwards, there were many people looking for oil all over the region. Now, it's helpful to talk a little bit about the oil industry just for a few minutes. The modern industry can really be traced back to the mid-1800s when the first oil was struck in Pennsylvania in the US. In the US, in the second half of the 1800s into the 1900s, we're going to see the rise of Standard Oil, the company that was founded by Rockefeller. Standard Oil, of course, is going to become notorious for its efficiency, for its monopoly, for its cartel, as it tries to deal with the ups and downs of the oil industry. Now, there is unimaginable wealth that comes when you find an oil well, whether you're an individual or an entire nation. But oil is actually quite common. At this point in time in history, it wasn't perhaps seen that way, but we have now seen that there's lots of countries that have oil. And whenever you find a well, there's perhaps a probability that you're going to find a well nearby, which meant that while you might have a lot of wealth, if you're able to mine that oil quickly, as other oils come into production, the price of oil can quickly collapse. So from the 1800s onwards, oil is kind of going up and down, up and down, up and down. And it became a very highly unstable industry. Now, this led Standard Oil under Rockefeller to simply create this massive monopoly. And they just either bought or made alliances with everybody, from the people who drilled the oil, to the people who transport the oil, to the people who refine the oil and then sell the the refined products. Gasoline was not the first product that was sold. It was actually kerosene, which is fuel for lamps. Gasoline was typically seen as a wasteful byproduct until cars became more common in the 1900s. So Standard Oil really one of the first to realize that if you want to avoid the ups and downs in prices of oil, you simply have to control everything. You have to effectively establish a cartel. A cartel, by its technical definition, is any organization that's able to control both prices and production. And Standard Oil was one of the first to be able to do both. So by being able to dictate exactly how much oil is being taken out of the ground and then dictate exactly what the price of oil is, Standard Oil is able to become one of the largest organizations in American history at this point in time. And it leads the Justice Department to seek the law to be able to break out Standard Oil. At the time, Standard Oil was known as a trust. We don't typically use trust anymore. Perhaps the closest equivalent might be a conglomerate, which also we don't typically see as much today compared to perhaps the 1980s under the conglomerates of like General Electric. Nonetheless, Standard Oil was a trust of multiple companies and multiple individuals who are playing a role. And the Justice Department at the turn of the century, early 1900s, and going into the 20s and the 30s, did not like this idea of trusts that were being built up and how powerful it seemed, and especially how it seems like they were able to control industries enough that they may be able to cause harm to consumers by keeping prices artificially high. So the Justice Department started a quest of antitrust legislation, with Standard Oil being perhaps one of the biggest wins in this early history. And when the Supreme Court upheld the many rulings up to that point, Standard Oil had to be broken up into different parts. It was eventually broken up into 7 parts, I believe. And some of the companies from those parts are still around today. We're going to see Exxon, Mobil, those two are actually combined today, Chevron, and a few others. So these individual parts come out from this antitrust legislation against Standard Oil. And the legacy of antitrust legislation is still around today. Of course, we just simply hear it against companies like Google and Facebook, where again, the Justice Department is wary about having too much power in a single corporation. So they're sort of harking back to an old law and trying to find a way to break them up through this antitrust legislation. That being said, the oil industry becomes ever more important as time goes on. Gasoline and cars is going to be the first maybe consumer-facing driver of oil beyond kerosene. But then for nations themselves, oil is going to take on an ever-increasing importance. World War I is going to see the rise of oil. We're going to see ships, for example, in the British Navy, who are going to convert themselves from using coal to using oil. It was typically easier to run an oil-powered ship. You needed less quantity of fuel, as oil is more compact than coal, and you needed fewer people to be able to run the engines that ran on oil. We're going to see tanks use oil to move around. So the countries who fight in World War I are going to come out of the war with an ever-increasing appreciation of the value of oil and what it might mean in future wars. They're also starting to see how important oil is to consumers from the perspective of cars and, of course, maybe some lamps, though electrification is going to change that market completely. Then World War II will come around, and the role of oil is going to become even more important as fuel is used for the airplanes that are going to bomb multiple cities. They're going to be used for the tanks and many of the transportation units around. Even cars themselves are going to play a role in World War II. So by the time World War II ends, oil is of the utmost importance. And whoever has oil is all of a sudden where countries want to be. So the Middle East will take on this high level of importance after World War II. And who's in the Middle East? But Britain. So despite Britain not having a lot of money after World War II, they simply believed that the control of oil reserves was simply too important to give up no matter what. Now, typically oil was structured on a form of a concession. So you might have a company, a private company, who's going to come in to a nation, let's say like Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia is going to give them a concession to look for oil in their region, whatever the borders are. From the moment the concession is given, typically the private companies have to start paying the government some amount of money. This might be like an annual payment. And then once oil is found, there might be other payments. And of course, once oil is being produced out of the ground and being exported, then the nations themselves will get a percentage of profits. The agreements of this concession are going to change over time. They're going to start small, and eventually the nations will be simply 50-50 partners, and eventually the nations will go on to control the entire concession themselves. But the role of private companies is important to note here. If we look at Saudi Arabia, which has one of the largest oil reserves ever, the original companies that came in were multiple companies who came together to form Aramco, which was formerly known as the Arabian American Oil Company. For the nations who possibly have oil, the concessions are a low-risk way to explore it. They're not necessarily putting up capital to go out and do the digging and exploration, and they get some of the benefits. Now, initially, of course, also meant that some of the benefits were not fully flowing into the nations themselves, as their percentage of profits may have been small. But nations like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Dubai and Abu Dhabi are going simply to get stronger and take more control over their oil reserves as the industry matures here in the area. Eventually, we're going to see the rise of things like OPEC, right, which is going to help many nations who belong to OPEC form a cartel to be able to control prices and production. Because again, the ups and downs of oil are simply too devastating. And for a private company, it might mean bankruptcy. But for a nation, it might mean a revolution, right? Many of these nations are going to become highly dependent on oil. It's going to be the single most important product they make. And their entire budget might be dictated by the price of oil. So if the price of oil drops by, let's say, 20% in the global markets, it doesn't mean that you have a little bit less revenue. It means that you have to cut your entire operating budget for your country by 20%. And for a lot of these nations here in the Middle East, the rule is based on the same tribal rule that we saw. So prosperity is the unspoken bargain. And if you're not able to provide prosperity, then there's questions as to whether you should be the tribal ruler yourself. So we see oil strike ever closer to Dubai, Iraq, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar. Kuwait is an intriguing example here to note, just because it's going to play a big role later on in the story when we have the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq and the war of the Gulf War in the 1990s. But Kuwait will find oil in 1938, and in less than 15 years is going to go from a small traditional Arab seaport, considerably smaller than Dubai, into an independent member of the United Nations. This is post-World War II. And the speed of change is just so staggering. There's stories of, you have the Bedouin in their tents in the middle of the desert, and outside the tents, there's Cadillacs standing there. Now, like many other nations, the driving of cars may not have been the most practical element when you have no roads, but the level of wealth that's flowing into these nations is just causing so much rapid change so quickly. Now, for the region of the United Arab Emirates, or the Trucial States, as they're known at this point in time, there is oil here, but it hasn't quite been found. Dubai actually had a concession in the 1930s, again, as it was looking for alternatives to the pearl trade, but that was derailed by World War II. Abu Dhabi had concessions, and some of the other regions also had concessions of themselves. Again, everyone's looking for oil here. And it's intriguing to note that the UAE, with its current borders, will eventually have about 8% of the world's proven oil reserves. I think today is maybe down to about 6%. So below the sands, besides the water, which is helpful, there's also a little bit of oil. Now, the rise in oil in the region, basically from the moment Iraq finds oil into 1920s, 1930s, and of course World War II, also means that now borders are going to become highly important among the 7 regions. For the Bedouin, borders simply make no sense, but for the tribal rulers, borders make a lot of sense now, because where you put your borders may determine where you find oil and what kind of falls within your concession. So for the 7 regions, there's a complex network of sort of neutral zones that belong to nobody. But now there's questions of well, maybe that zone belongs to Abu Dhabi, or maybe that neutral zone belongs to Dubai. So now there's tension rising between the 7 regions as they all try to position themselves for a future where they might find oil. The same, of course, is happening with other nations. Saudi Arabia Kuwait and Bahrain, where they're all kind of starting to see, where do our borders actually end? And perhaps can we extend our borders just a little bit, maybe get a few more miles, because you never know. There might be oil here, and we might as well take this claim here now before there's actual oil discovered, where it will be much more difficult to do it. The British play a role here in trying to mediate some of these disagreements, but the general policy was not to get involved, remember, in the day-to-day of this nation. So if this nation wanted to have disagreements about borders, so be it, as long as the maritime trade is not affected. Abu Dhabi and Dubai are actually going to have a small war between 1945 and 1948, primarily on dispute of frontiers. But the region is going to come together. The 7 regions are going to eventually join together forces. Now, oil will be discovered, first in Abu Dhabi in 1958. And typically, once oil is discovered, it might take several years before the first shipment of oil is actually exported. Dubai is going to find oil in 1966. But the other 5 regions are not going to find oil. And this will also explain some of the decisions that will be made when the United Arab Emirates is created in 1971. Now, the finding of oil was clearly beneficial to the vision of Sheik Rashid. We've been seeing him trying to do whatever he can with loans and gifts as possible. Effectively, loans and gifts from nations who do have oil, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar, respectively. And there's a quote here that I seen attributed to Sheik Rashid, perhaps how he felt when oil was found. The quote goes, my grandfather rode a camel, my father rode a camel, I drive a Mercedes, my son, Muhammad, drives a Land Rover, his son will drive a Land Rover, but his son will ride a camel. So there was perhaps an expectation that oil wealth is going to change the country, but what happens when the oil runs out? The realization that came up as oil was discovered here in Abu Dhabi and then Dubai was that the region has oil, but it seems to be a small amount, right? We saw that 8% or 6% of the world's reserves. It's not the same amount that something like Saudi Arabia has. Saudi Arabia has oil that can last for multiple generations. And even within the region itself, it was clear, even during this era of the 60s, that Abu Dhabi had the majority of the oil, and Dubai had actually only a small percentage of all the oil that was going to be available in the region. So the finding of oil has perhaps a sense of a bittersweet note for someone like Sheik Rashid. You're going to get a lot of money flowing into the country, into the city very soon, but it will eventually run out because you don't really have that much compared to your neighbor, Abu Dhabi, and definitely compared to your bigger neighbors like Saudi Arabia or Iraq and Iran. So what do you do with that? How do you take that oil wealth and perhaps parlay it into something else? And this is what we're going to see Sheik Rashid doing. Not a dependence on oil as your single export, because again, that would just be simply repeating the pearl trade mistakes. But perhaps how do you use that oil money, however small it might be, to simply supercharge everything else you want to do and become, hopefully, a post-oil economy? Now, as expected, oil is going to accelerate everything. In 1960, Dubai's 60,000 residents lived in an area of just 2 square miles, the size of perhaps a few city blocks, close to the water, as we can expect. By 1970, the city is going to hold 100,000 people in a 7 square mile, roughly the size of present-day Cambridge. 5 years later, Dubai more than doubled in size again, reaching 18 square miles with 183,000 people, about the size of Providence, Rhode Island. And by 1980, it doubled again to 32 square miles and 276,000 people, nearly the size of Buffalo. In those 2 decades, between 1960 and 1980, Dubai's area grew 16-fold and its population nearly quintupled. And this is already an area that already had a good chunk of the population of the region, of the 7 regions that we've been looking at. By the time we get to 1979, we're going to see several major projects come into production. One, of course, is going to be the Jebel Ali port that we had talked about earlier. The second was an aluminum smelter constructed and owned by the Dubai Aluminum Company. And the third is the Dubai International Trade Center, now known as the Dubai World Trade Center, which was the tallest building in the Middle East at the time. And again, this is the building that Queen Elizabeth II came in to inaugurate, and one of the largest in the world. So by the time we get to the end of the 70s into the 80s, Dubai has clearly established itself as the Middle East capital of commerce, one of its biggest recipients of foreign direct investment, its top financial center, biggest port, in some cases multiple biggest ports, and airport in the region, and home of the largest number of foreign businesses. Sheik Rashid's investments, or we might say even gambles, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are really largely responsible for where Dubai is by the time we get to the 80s and 90s. And we know that many of those gambles were made before oil money ever arrived. So we could say that the redeeming element of Dubai after that terrible period of the 20s and 30s with the crash of the pearl trade and the Great Depression was not gold, which became important when the creek was dredged, and it wasn't oil, which came in 1966, but it really wasn't any commodity. One could argue that perhaps the redeeming fact was that Sheik Rashid came in with a vision and a drive to make it happen, no matter what, whether they have oil money or not. And the fact that oil money came into the city simply meant that that vision would get magnified and achieved much quicker. Before we look at what Dubai looked like post-oil, as we get to the 80s and 90s, and specifically we get to the point where Sheik Rashid steps down and his son, Mohammed, takes over, it is helpful to take some time to look at the price of sudden oil wealth. What does it look like when a nation discovers oil and it just flows into it? And what is perhaps the price that Dubai paid, not just for that sudden influx of oil wealth, but for a very rapid development period that took place over about 20 years? Part 6. The New Pearls. The markets that have been in Dubai for a long time, initially perhaps just with the Hadar and the Bedouin, are now magnified. Dubai as a city is growing. It's bustling with activity. The ports are much bigger. And of course, oil is now in the picture. But what happens when a country finds oil? What are the things that change in such a rapid transformation? We saw briefly how Kuwait transformed itself in about 15 years. And there's something similar happening in Saudi Arabia. Of course, Abu Dhabi found oil. And there's this massive transformation to the society, to the culture, and to even the fundamental beliefs that have held the people in this area together for so long. So let's look at those few things. The first thing, of course, is this overnight wealth. We have to remember that the discovery of oil in this time period, 1900s, is quite akin to actually winning the lottery. The demand for oil seems insatiable. As soon as you start producing it or taking it out of the ground and exporting it, money starts flowing into the coffers of many nations. Of course, in the concessions themselves, they're getting paid annual fees even before oil is discovered. And then when oil gets exported, that just simply explodes. Dubai was better positioned for this explosion simply because they had been trying to modernize since the early 1900s. They had foundations of municipal government. They were engaging in major projects, whether it's the dredging of the creek or the Jebel Ali port we saw earlier. Nonetheless, it's hard to escape this massive influx of money that's going to flow not just to the government, but to the individuals. I find it helpful actually to look at Abu Dhabi just next door. Now, we got to remember Abu Dhabi was quite behind Dubai, so the changes that happened in Abu Dhabi over a short period of time are really quite extreme. But there are similarities as both are, of course, ruled in a similar fashion, and they're going to be part of the same union, the UAE, in a very short time. I mentioned before this book called From Rags to Riches, and the individual who wrote it happened to be a teenager during the 40s and 50s. Abu Dhabi discovers oil in 1958, and his dad also happened to be an advisor to the Sheikh at the time, and he got to see Abu Dhabi change. He's sort of old enough to remember what it was like before there were roads, electricity, running water, all that kind of stuff, and what happened when oil wealth really started to flow into the city. He tells a story, in 1950, His family is making a trip across the desert. He is just a kid. And they're, of course, riding camels. It's the only way to move yourself at this time in Abu Dhabi. And at one point in this very long trip, he almost sort of fell off the camel, and another family member caught him. And they made the trip successfully. But for him, it was quite a contrast to know that maybe about 25 years later, he was driving his family across the same desert in a Land Rover. Not a camel anymore. The trip that maybe took several days now could be done in maybe several hours in an extreme level of comfort. Air conditioning, whatever food you want, and so forth. Now, as oil wealth started to trickle into this different regions, the British had some advice. Remember, they have sort of this minimal engagement going on within the actual day-to-day matters of the Emirati regions. But they say, you know what, don't give handouts. Instead, give exclusive trade licenses to some families. And then, some families will become very wealthy. If you make one family the exclusive importer of Mercedes cars, then, that way they're just going to start to build a business, build skills. There's still, of course, going to be wealth being generated, but it won't be so much. Now, the sheiks did follow this approach. And today, when you look at the wealthy families in places like Dubai, you can actually trace that lineage back into very exclusive licenses that were given for, let's say, a port or an airport or some specific segment of an industry. And this is a way that a single family perhaps took control of this part of an industry. They grew it, they became wealthy, and then that wealth sort of eventually kind of went back into the nation itself. But they also gave handouts. When Abu Dhabi had changed ruler, by this point, they had some oil money now for a few years, but it hadn't really flown into really much. There were no major infrastructure projects going, and the conditions were still quite primitive. And the first thing the new ruler did, from the same family, was simply just give handouts. Just give cash money to anyone who wanted it. You could just go up to a palace and say, I want this amount of money, and then you just get a bundle of cash. And this actually follows throughout most of these years. And even today, we have equivalents to how the Emirati region sort of think about money. There is a big investment in infrastructure and in intangibles, education, healthcare, and so forth. But there is still a significant portion of money that's just simply given out in just straight up cash. And today, it might not be actual cash. It might just be some kind of digital money, of course. But it is, for all intents and purposes, cash. The stories here, again, particularly in Abu Dhabi, and I think there's probably some similarities here in Dubai, where people just simply weren't used to having cash, especially the amounts of cash they were having to handle. So it was common to see people walk out of the banks with simply cardboard boxes just full of cash. They got some kind of government check, they cash it, and they walk out with the cash. It wasn't quite clear what to do with it. Islam religion rejects the idea that you should actually put money into a bank to generate interest. So there was even, of course, some just beliefs that were clashing here as society was changing. And of course, many people did not really know what to do with cash. I mean, what do you do? Maybe you just go and buy a new car, or you try to build a new house. It wasn't quite sure. So the money kind of was moving very quickly. And for many of the people in this region, there had to be a change to understand, okay, you have all this cash, maybe you should invest a portion of it, or you should save some of it, or so on. And the government tried to do certain things to perhaps encourage it. There's cases of the government's giving out land. So they say maybe you get 3 pieces of land, one for your home, one for a business, and one for an investment or something. So there were the kind of initiatives, but it took time, right? It takes time for what were a hand-to-mouth existence to now change and say, actually, we have all the money we need. What do we do with it? Yeah, we might have to buy Cadillacs and Land Rovers, but then after that, what do you do with it, right? There's, the cars in particular are quite intriguing because they became very popular, as you can imagine. And there's stories of, the cars being unloaded at the dock, basically at the beach, and people would just walk up to this unloading process, go up to whoever seems to be in charge of it, and just simply say, hey, how much is that car that's being unloaded right there? And they say whatever, some amount, and be like, okay, that's okay. So they pull out a bundle of cash, give it to this person on the beach, walk over, get in the car, and just drive it, right? No registration papers, no licenses, no paperwork whatsoever, actually. They just simply drive off the car. So this is the way the wealth is changing. It's just so much wealth into a group of people that really have not seen this level of wealth before. And naturally, there's going to be adjustments and the government will have to do it. Now, what's intriguing is, in a way, there was so much money to go around that we might call this inefficiencies in how money is being spent, but perhaps it wasn't the worst thing just because there was a lot of money to go around. Ronald Corday, who I mentioned before, who has this beautiful book about pictures he took, he has this great paragraph here where, he explains that the briefcase had replaced the gun, the motor car had usurped the camel, air conditioning has become so common in homes, cars, offices, and hotels that the climate itself might have been transformed. And, this is very a far cry from the days when the greatest luxury was to have a wind tower, gently wafting cool air on the people beneath it. If you remember when the Iranians came over in the early 1900s, one of the signs of prosperity that they had in their homes was the fact that they had wind towers. Of course, by this point in time, air conditioning is just becoming common in anything you do. So you have taken what is a very difficult climate and sort of transform it. You're sort of taking control of your climate regardless of where you are in it. And at any given moment, you can control exactly what the climate is around you. One example here, of how difficult it can be to shake things off, or at least how that it can take time. And it's going to take much more time, perhaps, than it might take to build a tall building. In 73, the son of the ruler of Dubai, this is actually Mohammed, who's the son of Rashid, he became involved in an armed clash over a timeless Gulf issue, rights to a water well. And the well in question was on an ill-defined border between Sharjah and Dubai. It had been dug by Dubai, but then the inhabitants of Sharjah drew water from it. Because remember, just 75 years earlier, if there's a water well, you go up to it, and maybe you have to pull your rifle out to deal with any confrontations, but generally speaking, you're probably going to be fine. So the Sharjah inhabitants are drawing water from it, and Muhammad was just not happy with that. So he actually shot at them from a helicopter, and then undaunted, the people of Sharjah sort of returned fire, and it seems like the helicopter was actually brought down. Muhammad, of course, was fine. He's the current ruler of Dubai. But, this are the things that are simply having to catch up to this overnight wealth. That yes, you might be moving around in helicopters or moving around in Land Rovers, but you still have border issues and you still have disputes over water wells, and trying to form all this into the culture and the belief system that has been shaped over hundreds, if not thousands of years, within the Bedouin and of course the Hadar individuals. Another thing that happened around this time when oil is discovered, 58 for Abu Dhabi, 66 for Dubai, is the British decide to leave the area. Now, Britain was not in a good position after World War II. The debt to GDP ratio had soared to about 240% by 1945. And of course, Britain had to borrow heavily to finance its war efforts. The British economy had been converted to produce goods for the war, and military goods themselves actually constitute about 55% of GDP, which meant that the transition back to peacetime and peacetime goods was very difficult. We see measures of austerity, shortages of basic necessities such as housing and food, rationing continue for several years after the war. At the same time, of course, Britain is losing its overseas assets or colonies. You imagine something like India, right, which is going to gain independence in 1947. And the recovery was slow. This is actually despite the Americas injecting money into the economy through the Marshall Plan and providing, in some cases, aid and in other cases, loans. And this, of course, happening across many of the European nations. So Britain is not the only one here. France, West Germany, East Germany, and so forth. In 1968, the British announced that they are withdrawing from the Arabian Gulf. It seems like the cost of maintaining the British warships was just too much. Intriguingly, I've seen numbers that it cost the British about 12 million pounds per year. And the sheiks of both Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and the other regions are actually going to offer to pay the British to stay. They're going to make an offer upwards of 20 million per year, because the sheiks did not want the British to leave. Despite this sort of love-hate relationship they have had now over many years, generally speaking, the regions are coming into wealth, and they're still susceptible to other regions. There's positive relationship with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar, and so on. but you never quite know, right? And we got to remember that these fears were not completely unfounded. In about 20 years' time, Iraq is going to invade Kuwait and is going to start the Gulf War. So for the small regions who are just starting to get developed, starting to form governments, not having the British really seems more of an issue than not. So they're willing to pay for it. Now, the British are not going to take the money. Maybe the cost was not such a simple, or perhaps for the British, it was perhaps too much to have this small nation of Abu Dhabi and Dubai and so on offered to pay them almost like mercenaries when just 20 years earlier, the British were the dominant force in this area, right? And we gotta remember that shortly before the war, this is the empire where the sun never set. So the British are not staying no matter what. And they announced their departure to 1971. So the Sheik of Abu Dhabi and of Dubai, Rashid, as we seen earlier, they started to have conversations around what a federation might look like. And they led the effort. Initially, they actually imagined that it might not be their 7 regions that we saw at the beginning of our story. It might also include Qatar and Bahrain, but both of them are actually going to pull out. They actually discovered oil much earlier than Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and they were just simply much more developed, so they're not going to be part of this federation. But for the other 5 regions, the federation does make sense, right? They don't have oil, they're just as susceptible, and perhaps it might make sense to be band together with both Dubai, but primarily Abu Dhabi, as they are the ones who have the most oil. In 1971, the United Arab Emirates will be formed, with Abu Dhabi being the major partner, and Dubai playing the role of a junior partner, and the other Emirates playing a much lesser role. Abu Dhabi became the capital of the UAE, and really the sole funder of the entire UAE government. Now, the goal of the UAE was, of course, the idea of being able to spread wealth, primarily from Abu Dhabi to the other areas. And this has worked out in practice. Let me give you some examples here. This is more recent times. Today, Abu Dhabi actually contributes about 90% of the UAE's federal budget, with Dubai contributing the rest. The federal budget in 2023 was $23 billion, meaning that Abu Dhabi contributed just over $20 billion. Again, they're doing this every year. They have also done direct financial aid to the smaller Emirates. In 2011, for example, Abu Dhabi actually allocated $1.6 billion for infrastructure projects. In 2020, during the pandemic, they provided direct financial aid across the different UAE Emirate regions. There's a fund for development, actually called the Abu Dhabi Fund for Development. And they have done major projects, including water and electricity projects. They have funded housing grants and social welfare programs. They have backed entities for electricity, water across the other Emirates. So it's no crazy to think that Abu Dhabi has transferred tens of billions of dollars since 1971 to the other Emirate regions. Again, Dubai contributes somewhat to this, but it's truly that Abu Dhabi kind of sort of runs the show and gets the majority of votes. But for the other Emirate regions, they have benefited from the oil wealth in Abu Dhabi, and of course from the protection that has come from it. And we're going to see the UAE become a bit more of an important player as that Gulf War will break out between Iraq and Kuwait. They're not necessarily going to go war themselves, but they're going to have the resources to play a role in the region. When Dubai joins the UAE in 1971, it is quite much more advanced than Abu Dhabi. It really had a public administration system. They had departments with different responsibilities for education, health, customs, petroleum, passports, police force, land, property, postal services. The town had a municipal council, which was founded in 1957, and it was responsible for things like public utilities, slaughterhouses, markets, fire brigades, hospitals. There was some town planning going on. They actually had the first chamber of commerce on the Torshal Coast that was founded in 1965. They were increasing the water and electricity supplies. They were building an international airport. We're going to see that soon. A modern banking system was starting to develop in Dubai. And of course, we saw the largest dry dock in the world. So the UAE is formed. Again, this is just another consequence of partially the oil and partially this changing world that's going on as the British depart from the Middle East. As oil flows into the country, there's also a higher need for labor. We're going to start to see this gap between the citizens, what they are called sort of the nationals, the Emiratis themselves, and the need for foreign labor. We might call them expats And of course, these major construction projects simply require foreign labor to make it work. So we're going to see a huge influx of foreign labor starting in the 60s and 70s and just going to continue to grow. We're going to see a little bit more of that in a second, but just a heads up. A minority is also starting to grow in the Emirati citizens themselves. The nationals, which were primarily, the major group in the area, are now slowly going to become a minority to the point that in modern day Dubai, they are, less than 10%, in some cases maybe 3 to 5% of the entire population. So this minority, again, will start to grow. And some of the seeds and issues that we hear in Dubai today actually will arise from this very extreme split between the citizens, nationals, and the foreign labor expats that will be needed to make this massive transformation happen. And now that transformation is being supercharged by oil. The vision that Rashid had for Dubai, of course, was one where you can build anything. There is no regulation committee or opposition. If the Sheik Rashid wants it, and of course today, modern day Sheikh Mohammed, it will happen. This kind of leads to what some might describe as almost like an unhinged version of capitalism, but it is this true interpretation of the laissez-faire model that has been talked about, where the state really rarely interferes with anything sort of related to business. They have stepped in depending on the situation, but they much prefer to let business grow and maintain that entrepot mindset where they are the center of trade. And this is intriguing, right? We saw that uprising of the merchants in the 1930s. So this will continue on, but now, again, with just way more money. If you want to build this huge building, of course, you can do it. If you want to go ahead and start this industry, you can do it. Whatever you have from a perspective of business is going to be supported by the state. Now, one of the things that Dubai is perhaps the most known for are the buildings. For developers and architects, Dubai will become a form of paradise. Whatever feasible idea you can come up with, you can do it as long as it's big and iconic. Dubai in this time is going to adopt a belief that it's not just about becoming diversified from one single product. It's also about becoming the best at something. So you want to do buildings, you want to do hotels. Why don't we create the most iconic hotels the world has ever seen? You're going to construct a building. Let's do the tallest building possible. You want to do a port? We'll do the largest man-made port. Now, this bias towards simply just getting things done, building and modernizing, of course, will have some kind of impacts. We're going to see raw sewage being dumped directly into the Arabian Gulf. We're going to see some beaches have some issues. There's going to be reclamation of land, actually, by the Dubai government. And then that also creates some issues. So there are some consequences. But again, in this part of the world, at this point in time, you don't really hear environmental concerns or what about the downsides of this. It's just simply, you want to get it done, let's do it. We are in a building mode. If you're the kind of person that has a big vision for something, we can do it, and we have the resources now. So it's not even about a lack of resources. It's really just more, do we even have the right ideas? Are they big enough to justify us going into it? Now, the plus side of this approach means that things do get done pretty quickly. If the sheikh says that he wants something, it will get done. There's a point here in the story where they open something like 31 new lanes over the creek in about 2 years. Just sort of lanes that cross over the creek, like roads. And that just seems incredibly quick. In another country like Britain or the US, the planning committee will have to do research for years to see if it's even feasible. They might discover that there's some rare animal species that lives there. There might be opposition, and the whole project might just simply never get done. If it gets done, it might just take 10 years. But again, at this point in Dubai's history, things are getting done in months, maybe years, but we're talking about single-digit years to get major projects done. Of course, the influx of wealth is going to create what today might be described as a shopping culture. In a place where money flows at such extreme levels, malls are going to become a major part of the culture. And even today, actually, it's sort of malls become like a meeting place. there's a practicality to this, with such hot temperature, going into a mall that's air conditioned is enjoyable. But we're going to see this. And today, there's an estimate that about 30% of the UAE residents go shopping at least once a week. This is second internationally only to Hong Kong. And about 80% of UAE residents go shopping simply as something to do. And they spend money while shopping. This is not just sort of window shopping, right? And that's why today, when we think about major brands like luxury brands, they likely have a very strong presence in the UAE, a very strong presence in Dubai, of course, because there's simply a lot of money that's flowing through all the stores. The increase in wealth will also lead to maybe shady political links. We got to remember, of course, that the UAE is an Arab country. They will support each other. There are cases where some of the support has led to questions from other nations. The UAE was one of only 3 countries to officially recognize the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, and they were suspected actually of providing arms to them. There's even a story here where the UAE royal family members actually went hunting once with Osama bin Laden. This is sometime in the 90s, late 90s, and the CIA had found bin Laden at this hunting camp, and they were thinking about taking him out. And they rejected the plan because there were UAE royal members in that camp as well. And they thought that if they did some kind of strike and they end up killing UAE royal family members, it would be a huge political issue. And of course, we know when 9/11 will occur in 2001, many of the terrorists who flew to the United States actually came from Dubai, and the funding for the 9/11 campaign actually moved through Dubai banks. Now, this is not to say that somehow Dubai is responsible for all this. It's just most likely a consequence of a system that is simply open to anything. If you want to do business in Dubai, you're welcome. What kind of business you're doing? Well, that may not be such an important detail. But the culture at this time is we want to do it all. We welcome everybody. We'll figure out the downsides later on, if at all. So clearly, oil supercharged Rashid's vision. It allowed for everything to happen at a much faster pace. But there were changes that occur not just simply because of the rapid modernization that Rashid wanted to do, but because of this massive influx of wealth. So what does Dubai look like towards the end of the Sheik Rashid's rule? Let's look at that next. And that is all for episode 2 of 3 in the Dubai series. I hope you're enjoying this. My name is Ruben Ugarte. We are leaving Dubai this time in a little bit of a different spot. It's no longer struggling with the collapse of the pearl industry like we saw at the end of episode 1. It is clearly growing into a global icon, into a city that's more than just any single industry. A city that's going to span iconic buildings that seemingly defy these dry conditions of the desert in which Dubai finds itself in. In the next episode, the third and final episode in the series, we are going to see how Dubai changed by the end of Rashid's rule. He will die in 1990, and his son, Mohammed, is going to become the Sheikh. He's also the current ruler of Dubai. So check back next week as we pick up our story and see what Dubai looked like after the reign of Sheik Rashid.